Chapter 25 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 25. 1. He awoke to stretch cheerfully as he listened to the sparrows, then to remember that everything was wrong, that he was determined to go astray, and not in the least enjoying the process. Why, he wondered, should he be in rebellion? What was it all about? Why not be sensible, stop all this idiotic running around, and enjoy himself with his family, his business, the fellows at the club? What was he getting out of rebellion? Misery and shame. The shame of being treated as an offensive small boy by a ragamuffin like Ida Putnick. And yet, always he came back to, and yet, whatever the misery, he could not regain contentment with a world which, once doubted, became absurd. Only, he assured himself, he was through with chasing after girls. By noontime he was not so sure even of that. If in Miss McGowan, Louetta Swanson, and Ida he had failed to find the lady kind and lovely, it did not prove that she did not exist. He was haunted by the ancient thought that somewhere must exist the not impossible, she who would understand him, value him, and make him happy. 2. Mrs. Babbitt returned in August. On her previous absences he had missed her reassuring buzz, and her arrival he had made a feat. Now, though he dared not hurt her by letting a hint of it appear in his letters, he was sorry that she was coming before he had found himself, and he was embarrassed by the need of meeting her and looking joyful. He loitered down to the station. He studied the summer resort posters, lest he have to speak to acquaintances and expose his uneasiness. But he was well trained. When the train clanked in, he was out on a cement platform, peering into the chair cars, and as he saw her in the line of passengers moving toward the vestibule, he waved his hat. At the door he embraced her and announced, "Well, well, 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 by golly, you look fine. You look fine." Then he was aware of Tinka. Here was something, this child, with her absurd little nose and lively eyes, that loved him, believed him great, and as he clasped her, lifted and held her till she squealed, he was for the moment come back to his old steady self. Tinka sat beside him in the car, with one hand on the steering wheel, pretending to help him drive, and he shouted back to his wife, "I'll bet the kid will be the best chauffeur in the family. She holds the wheel like an old professional." All the while he was dreading the moment when he would be alone with his wife and she would patiently expect him to be ardent. 3. There was about the house an unofficial theory that he was to take his vacation alone, to spend a week or 10 days in Catawba, but he was nagged by the memory that a year ago he had been with Paul in Maine. He saw himself returning, finding peace there, and the presence of Paul in a life primitive and heroic. Like a shock came the thought that he actually could go, only he couldn't really. He couldn't leave his business, and Myra would think it sort of funny, his going away off there alone. Of course he'd decided to do whatever he damn pleased from now on, but still go way off to Maine. He went after lengthy meditations with his wife, since it was inconceivable to explain that he was going to seek Paul's spirit in the wilderness. He frugally employed the lie prepared over a year ago and scarcely used it at all. He said that he had to see a man in New York on business. He could not have explained even to himself why he withdrew from the bank several $100 more than he needed, nor why he kissed Tinka so tenderly and cried, "God bless you, baby." From the train he waved to her till she was but a scarlet spot beside the brown, bulkier presence of Mrs. Babbitt, at the end of a steel and cement aisle, ending in vast barred gates. With melancholy he looked back at the last suburb of Zenith. All the way north he pictured the Maine guides, simple and strong and daring, jolly as they played stud poker in their unsealed shack, wise in woodcraft as they tramped the forest and shot the rapids. He particularly remembered Joe Paradise, half Yankee, half Indian. If he could but take up a backwoods claim with a man like Joe, work hard with his hands, be free and noisy in a flannel shirt, and never come back to this dull decency. Or like a trapper in a northern Canada movie, plunge through the forest, make camp in the Rockies, a grim and wordless caveman. Why not? He could do it. There'd be enough money at home for the family to live on till Verona was married and Ted self-supporting. Old Henry T. would look out for them. Honestly, why not really live? He longed for it, admitted that he longed for it, then almost believed that he was going to do it. Whenever common sense snorted, "Nonsense! Folks don't run away from decent families and partners, just simply don't do it, that's all." Then Babbitt answered pleadingly, "Well, it wouldn't take any more nerve than for Paul to go to jail, and Lord, how I'd like to do it. Moccasins, six-gun frontier town gamblers, sleep under the stores. Be a regular man, with the he-men like Joe Paradise. Gosh!" So he came to Maine again, stood on the wharf before the camp hotel, again spat heroically into the delicate and shivering water, while the pines rustled, mountains glowed, and a trout leaped and fell in a sliding circle. He hurried to the guide shack, as to his real home, his real friends, long missed. They would be glad to see him. They would stand up and shout, "Why, here's Mr. Babbitt! He ain't one of these ordinary sports. He's a real guy." In their boarded and rather littered cabin, the guides sat about the greasy table playing stud poker with greasy cards. Half a dozen wrinkled men in old trousers and easy felt hats. They glanced up and nodded. Joe Paradise, a swart, aging man with a big mustache, grunted, "How do? Back again?" Silence except for the clatter of chips. Babbitt stood beside them, very lonely. He hinted, after a period of highly concentrated playing, "Guess I might take a hand, Joe." "Sure. Sit in. How many chips you want?" "Let's see. You were here with your wife last year, wa'n't you?" said Joe Paradise. That was all of Babbitt's welcome to the old home. He played for half an hour before he spoke again. His head was reeking with the smoke of pipes and cheap cigars, and he was weary of pears and four flushes, resentful of the way in which they ignored him. He flung at Joe, "Working now?" "Nope." "Like to guide me for a few days?" "Well, just soon. I ain't engaged till next week." Only thus did Joe recognize the friendship Babbitt was offering him. Babbitt paid up his losses and left the shack rather childishly. Joe raised his head from the coils of smoke like a seal rising from surf, grunted, "I'll come around tomorrow," and dived down to his three aces. Neither in the voiceless cabin, fragrant with planks of new-cut pine, nor along the lake, nor in the sunset clouds which presently eddied behind the lavender-misted mountains, could Babbitt find the spirit of Paul as a reassuring presence. He was so lonely that after supper he stopped to talk with an ancient old lady, a gasping and steadily discoursing old lady, by the stove in the hotel office. He told her of Ted's presumable future triumphs in the State University, and of Tinka's remarkable vocabulary, till he was homesick for the home he had left forever. Through the darkness, through that northern pine-walled silence, he blundered down to the lake front and found a canoe. There was no paddle in it, with a board, sitting awkwardly amidships and poking at the water rather than paddling. He made his way far out on the lake. The lights of the hotel and the cottages became yellow dots. A cluster of glowworms at the base of Sachem Mountain. Larger and even more impenetrable was the mountain in the star-filtered darkness, and the lake a limitless pavement of black marble. He was dwarfed and dumb and a little awed, but that insignificance freed him from the pomposities of being Mr. George F. Babbitt of Zenith, saddened and freed his heart. Now he was conscious of the presence of Paul, fancied him, rescued from prison, from Zilla, and the brisk exactitudes of the tar roofing business. Playing his violin at the end of the canoe, he vowed, "I will go on. I'll never go back. Now that Paul's out of it, I don't want to see any of those damn people again. I was a fool to get sore because Joe Paradise didn't jump up and hug me. He's one of these woodsmen, too wise to go yelping and talking your arm off like a city man. But get him back in the mountains, out on the trail, that's real living. 4. Joe reported at Babbitt's cabin at 9 the next morning. Babbitt greeted him as a fellow caveman. "Well, Joe, how'd you feel about hitting the trail and getting away from these darn soft summaries and women and all?" "All right, Mr. Babbitt." "What do you say we go over to Boxcar Pond? They tell me the shack there isn't being used, and camp out." "Well, all right, Mr. Babbitt, but it's nearer to Sauket Pond, and you can get just about as good fishing there." "No, I want to get out into the real wilds." "Well, all right." "We'll put the old packs on our backs and get into the woods and really hike." "I think maybe it would be easier to go by water through Lake Chogue. We can go all the way by motorboat, flat-bottom boat with an Evinrude." "No, sir. Bust up the Quiet with a chugging motor? Not on your life. You just throw a pair of socks in the old pack and tell 'em what you want for eats. I'll be ready soon as you are." "Most of the sports go by boat, Mr. Babbitt. It's a long walk." "Look here, Joe, are you objecting to walking?" "Oh, no, I guess I can do it. But I haven't tramped for 16 years. Most of the sports go by boat. But I can do it if you say so, I guess." Joe walked away in sadness. Babbitt had recovered from his touchy wrath before Joe returned. He pictured him as warming up and telling the most entertaining stories. But Joe had not yet warmed up when they took the trail. He persistently kept behind Babbitt, and however much his shoulders ached from the pack, however sorely he panted, Babbitt could hear his guide panting equally. But the trail was satisfying, a path brown with pine needles and rough with roots, among the balsams and ferns, the sudden groves of white birch. He became credulous again and rejoiced in sweating. When he stopped to rest he chuckled. "Guess we're hitting it up pretty good for a couple of old birds, huh?" "Uh-huh," admitted Joe. "This is a mighty pretty place. Look, you can see the lake down through the trees. I tell you, Joe, you don't appreciate how lucky you are to live in the woods like this, instead of in a city with trolleys grinding with typewriters clacking and people bothering the life out of you all the time. I wish I knew the woods like you do. Say, what's the name of that little red flower?" Rubbing his back, Joe regarded the flower resentfully. "Well, some folks call it one thing and some folks call it another. I guess I just call it a pink flower." Babbitt blessedly ceased thinking as tramping turned into blind plodding. He was submerged in weariness. His plump legs seemed to go on by themselves without guidance, and he mechanically wiped away the sweat which stung his eyes. He was too tired to be consciously glad as, after sun-scourged mile of corduroy tote road through the swamp, where flies hovered over a hot waste of brush, they reached the cool shore of Boxcar Pond. When he lifted the pack from his back, he staggered from the change in balance, and for a moment could not stand erect. He lay beneath an ample blossomed maple tree near the guest shack and joyously felt sleep running through his veins. He awoke towards dusk, and to find Joe efficiently cooking bacon and eggs and flapjacks for supper, and his admiration of the woodsman returned. He sat on a stump and felt virile. "Joe, what would you do if you had a lot of money? Would you stick to guiding, or would you take a claim way back in the woods and be independent of people?" For the first time Joe brightened. He chewed his cud a second and bubbled, "I've often thought about that. If I had the money, I'd go down to Tinker's Falls and open a swell shoe store." After supper Joe proposed a game of stud poker, but Babbitt refused with brevity, and Joe contentedly went to bed at 8. Babbitt sat on the stump, facing the dark pond, slapping mosquitoes. Save the snoring guide, there was no other human being within 10 miles. He was lonelier than he had ever been in his life. Then he was in Zenith. He was worrying as to whether Miss McGowan wasn't paying too much for carbon paper. He was at once resenting and missing the persistent teasing at the Roughnecks table. He was wondering what Zilla Riesling was doing now. He was wondering whether, after the summer's maturity of being a garage man, Ted would get busy in the university. He was thinking of his wife. if she wouldn't be so darn satisfied with just settling down. "No, I won't. I won't go back. I'll be 50 in 3 years, 60 in 13 years. I'm going to have some fun before it's too late. I don't care. I will." He thought of Ida Putnick and Luella Swanson, of the nice widow, what was her name? Tanis Jodique, the one for whom he'd found the flat. He was enmeshed in imaginary conversations. Then, I can't seem to get away from thinking about folks." Thus it came to him merely to run away was folly, because he could never run away from himself. That moment he started for Zenith. In his journey there was no appearance of flight, but he was fleeing, and 4 days afterwards he was on the Zenith train. He knew that he was slinking back, not because it was what he longed to do, but because it was all he could do. He scanned again his discovery that he could never run away from Zenith and family and office, because in his own brain he bore the office and the family and every street and disquiet and illusion of Zenith. "But I'm going to. Oh, I'm going to start something," he vowed, and he tried to make it valiant. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 26. 1. As he walked through the train, looking for familiar faces, he saw only one person whom he knew, and that was Seneca Doane, the lawyer who, after the blessings of being in Babbitt's own class at college and of becoming corporation counsel, had turned crank, had headed farmer labor tickets, and fraternized with admitted socialists. Though he was in rebellion naturally, Babbitt did not care to be seen talking with such a fanatic. But in all the Pullmans he could find no other acquaintance, and reluctantly he halted. Seneca Doane was a slight, thin-haired man, rather like Chum Frink, except that he hadn't Frink's grin. He was reading a book called The Way of All Flesh. It looked religious to Babbitt, and he wondered if Doane could possibly have been converted and turned decent and patriotic. "Why, hello, Doane," he said. Doane looked up. His voice was curiously kind. "Oh, how do, Babbitt." "Been away, eh?" "Yes, I have been in Washington." "Washington, eh? How's the old government making out?" "It's Won't you sit down?" "Thanks. Don't care if I do. Well, been quite a while since I had a good chance to talk to you, Doane. I was sorry you didn't turn up at the last class dinner." "Oh, thanks." "How's the unions coming? Going to run for mayor again?" Doane seemed restless. He was fingering the pages of his book. He said, "I might," as though it didn't mean anything in particular, and he smiled. Babbitt liked that smile, and hunted for conversation. "Saw a bang-up cabaret in New York, the Good Morning Cutie Bunch, at the Hotel Minton." "Yes, they're pretty girls. I danced there one evening." "Oh, like dancing?" "Naturally. I like dancing and pretty women and good food better than anything else in the world. Most men do." "By gosh, Doane, I thought you fellows wanted to take all the good eats and everything away from us." "No, not at all. What I'd like to see is the meetings of the garment workers held at the Ritz, with a dance afterwards. Isn't that reasonable?" "It might be a good idea, all right. Well, shame I haven't seen more of you recent years. Oh, say, I hope you haven't held it against me, my bucking you as mayor, going on the stump for Prout. You see, I'm an organization Republican, and I kind of felt—" "There's no reason why you shouldn't fight me. I have no doubt you're good for the organization. I remember in college you were an unusually liberal, sensitive chap. I can still recall your saying to me that you were going to be a lawyer and take the cases of the poor for nothing, and fight the rich. And I remember I said I was going to be one of the rich myself, and buy paintings and live at Newport. I'm sure you inspired us all." Well, I've always aimed to be liberal, Babbitt was enormously shy and proud and self-conscious. He tried to look like the boy he had been a quarter century ago, and he shone upon his old friend Seneca Doane as he rumbled, "Trouble with a lot of these fellows, even the live wires and some of 'em that think they're forward-looking, is they aren't broad-minded and liberal. Now, I always believe in giving the other fellow a chance and listening to his ideas." "That's fine." "Tell you how I figure it. A little opposition is good for all of us, so a fellow, especially if he's a business man and engaged in doing the work of the world, ought to be liberal." "Yes?" "I always say a fellow ought to have vision and ideals. I guess some of the fellows in my business think I'm pretty visionary, but I just let 'em think what they want to think and go right on, same as you do." "By golly, it's nice to sit and visit and kind of, you might say, brush up on our ideals." "But of course the visionaries do rather get beaten. Doesn't it bother you?" "Not a bit. Nobody can dictate to me what I think." "You're the man. I want you to help me. I want you to talk to some of the business men and try to make them a little more liberal in their attitude toward poor Beecher Ingram." "Ingram? But why, he's this nut preacher that got kicked out of the Congregational Church, isn't he? And preaches free love and sedition." This, Doane explained, was indeed the general concept of Beecher Ingram, but he himself saw Beecher Ingram as a priest of the Brotherhood of Man, of which Babbitt was notoriously an upholder. So would Babbitt keep his acquaintances from hounding Ingram and his forlorn little church? "You bet. I'll call down any of the boys I hear getting funny about Ingram," Babbitt said affectionately to his dear friend Doane. Doane warmed up and became reminiscent. He spoke of student days in Germany, of lobbying for single tax in Washington, of international labor conferences. He mentioned his friends, Lord Wycombe, Colonel Wedgwood, Professor Piccoli. Babbitt had always supposed that Doane associated only with the I.W.W., but now he nodded gravely, as one who knew Lord Wycombes by the score, and he got two references to Sir Gerald Doak. He felt daring and idealistic and cosmopolitan. Suddenly, in his new spiritual grandeur, he was sorry for Zilla Riesling, and understood her as those ordinary fellows at the Booster Club never could. 2. 5 hours after he had arrived in Zenith, he told his wife how hot it was in New York. He went to call on Zilla. He was buzzing with ideas and forgiveness. He'd get Paul released. He'd do things, vague but highly benevolent things, for Zilla. He'd be as generous as his friend Seneca Doane. He had not seen Zilla since Paul had shot her, and he still pictured her as buxom, high-colored, lively, and a little blowsy. As he drove up to her boarding-house in a depressing back street below the wholesale district, he stopped in discomfort. At an upper window, leaning on her elbows, was a woman with the features of Zilla, but she was bloodless and aged, like a yellow wad of old paper crumpled into wrinkles. Where Zilla had bounded and jiggled, this woman was dreadfully still. He waited half an hour before she came into the boarding-house parlor. 50 times he opened the book of photographs of the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. 50 times he looked at the picture of the Court of Honor. He was startled to find Zilla in the room. She wore a black, streaky gown, which she had tried to brighten with a girdle of crimson ribbon. The ribbon had been torn and patiently mended. He noted this carefully, because he did not wish to look at her shoulders. One shoulder was lower than the other. One arm she carried in contorted fashion as though it were paralyzed, and behind a high collar of cheap lace there was a gouge in the anemic neck, which had once been shining and softly plump. "Yes," she said. "Well, well, old Zilla. By golly, it's good to see you again." "He can send his messages through a lawyer." "Why, rats, I didn't come here just because of him. Came as an old friend." "You waited long enough." "Well, you know how it is. Figured you wouldn't want to see a friend of his for quite some time, and sit down, honey. Let's be sensible. We've all of us done a bunch of things that we hadn't ought to, but maybe we can sort of start over again. Honest, Zelia, I'd like to do something to make you both happy." Know what I thought today? Mind you, Paul doesn't know a thing about this. Doesn't know I was going to come to see you. I got to thinking, Zelia's a fine, big-hearted woman, and she'll understand that Paul had his lesson now. Why wouldn't it be a fine idea if you asked the governor to pardon him? Believe he would if it came from you. No, wait. Just think how good you'd feel if you were generous." "Yes, I wish to be generous." She was sitting primly, speaking icily. "For that reason I wish to keep him in prison as an example to evil doers. I've gotten religion, George, since the terrible thing that man did to me. Sometimes I used to be unkind, and I wished for worldly pleasures, for dancing in the theater. But when I was in the hospital, the pastor of the Pentecostal communion faith used to come to see me, and he showed me, right from the prophecies written in the Word of God, that the day of judgment is coming, and all the members of the older churches are going straight to eternal damnation, because they only do lip service and swallow the world, the flesh, and the devil." For 15 wild minutes she talked, pouring out admonitions to flee the wrath to come, and her face flushed, her dead voice recaptured something of the shrill energy of the old Zilla. She wound up with a furious, "It's the blessing of God himself that Paul should be in prison now, and torn and humbled by punishment, so that he may yet save his soul, and so other wicked men, these horrible chasers of women in lust, may have an example." Babbitt had itched and twisted. As in church, he dared not move during the sermon, so now he felt he must seem attentive, though her screeching denunciations flew past him like carrion birds. He sought to be calm and brotherly. "Yes, I know, Zilla, but gosh, it certainly is the essence of religion to be charitable, isn't it? Let me tell you how I figure it. What we need in the world is liberalism. Liberally. If we're going to get anywhere. I've always believed in being broad-minded and liberal." "You? Liberal?" It was very much the old Zilla. "Why, George Babbitt, you're about as broad-minded and liberal as a razor blade." "Oh, I am I? Well, just let me tell you, I'm as by golly liberal as you are religious. Anyway, you religious?"
"I am so. Our pastor says I sustain him in the faith."
"I'll bet you do, with Paul's money. But just to show you how liberal I am, I'm going to send a check for $10 to this Beecher Ingram, because a lot of fellows are saying the poor cuss preaches sedation and free love, and they're trying to run him out of town."
"And they're right. They ought to run him out of town. Why, he preaches, if you can call it preaching, in a theater, in the house of Satan. You don't know what it is to find God, to find peace, to behold the snares that the devil spreads out at our feet. Oh, I'm so glad to see the mysterious purposes of God in having Paul harm me and stop my wickedness. And Paul's getting his. Good and plenty for the cruel things he did to me. And I hope he dies in prison."
Babbitt was up, hat in hand, growling, "Well, if that's what you call being at peace, for heaven's sake, just warn me before you go to war, will you?" 3. Vast is the power of cities to reclaim the wanderer. More than mountains or the shore-devouring sea, a city retains its characters, imperturbable, cynical, holding behind apparent changes an essential purpose. Though Babbitt had deserted his family and dwelt with Joe Paradise in the wilderness, though he had become a liberal, though he had been quite sure, on the night before he reached Zenith, that neither he nor the city would be the same again, 10 days after Herbert's return, he could not believe that he had ever been away. Nor was it at all evident to his acquaintances that there was a new George F. Babbitt, save that he was more irritable under the incessant chaffing at the athletic club, and once, when Vergil Gunch observed that Seneca Doane ought to be hanged, Babbitt snorted, "Oh, rats, he's not so bad." At home he grunted, "Hey," across the newspaper to his commentatory wife,
and was delighted by Tinka's new red tam-o'-shanter, and announced, "No class to that corrugated iron garage. Have to build me a nice frame one." Verona and Kenneth Escott appeared really to be engaged. In his newspaper Escott had conducted a pure food crusade against commission houses. As a result, he had been given an excellent job in a commission house, and he was making a salary on which he could marry, and denouncing irresponsible reporters who wrote stories criticizing commission houses without knowing what they were talking about. This September Ted had entered the State University as a freshman in the College of Arts and Sciences. The university was at Mohalis, only 15 miles from Zenith, and Ted often came down for the weekend. Babbitt was worried. Ted was going in for everything but books. He had tried to make the football team as a light halfback. He was looking forward to the basketball season. He was on the committee for the freshman hop, and as a Zenithite, an aristocrat among yokels, he was being rushed by 2 fraternities. But of his studies Babbitt could learn nothing save a mumbled, "Oh, I think those tips the teachers just give you a lot of junk about literature and economics." One weekend Ted proposed, "Say, Dad, why can't I transfer over from the College of the School of Engineers and take mechanical engineering? You always holler that I never study, but honest, I would study there." "No, the engineering school hasn't got standing as the college has," fretted Babbitt. "I'd like to know how it hasn't. The engineers can play on any of the teams." There was much explanation of the dollars and cents values of being known as a college man when you go into the law, and truly oratorical account of the lawyer's life. Before he was through with it, Babbitt had Ted a United States Senator. Among the great lawyers he mentioned was Seneca Doane. "But gee whiz!" Ted marveled. "I thought you always said this Doane was a regular nut." "That's no way to speak of a great man. Doane's always been a good friend of mine. In fact, I helped him in college. I started him out, and you might say inspired him, just because he's sympathetic with the aims of labor. A lot of chumps that lack liberty and broad-mindedness think he's a crank. But let me tell you, there's mighty few of 'em that rake in the fees he does. And he's a friend of some of the strongest, most conservative men in the world, like Lord Wycombe, this big English nobleman that's so well known, and, you know, which would you rather be, in with a lot of greasy mechanics and laboring men, or chum up to a real fellow like Lord Wycombe and get invited to his house for parties?" "Well, gosh," sighed Ted. The next weekend he came joyously with, "Say, Dad, why couldn't I take mining engineering instead of the academic course? You talk about standing. Maybe there isn't much in mechanical engineering, but the miners, gee, they got 7 out of 11 of the new elections in New Tao 2." End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt, by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 27. 1. The strike, which turned Zenith into 2 belligerent camps, white and red, began late in September with the walkout of telephone girls and linemen in protest against the reduction of wages. The newly formed Union of Dairy Product Workers went out, partially in sympathy and partially in demand for a 44-hour week. They were followed by the Truck Drivers' Union. Industry was tied up, and the whole city was nervous with talk of a trolley strike, a printer's strike, a general strike. Furious citizens, trying to get telephone calls through strike-breaking girls, danced helplessly. Every truck that made its way from the factories to the freight stations was guarded by a policeman trying to look stoical besides the scab driver. A line of 50 trucks from the Zenith Steel and Machinery Company was attacked by strikers rushing out from the sidewalk, pulling drivers from the seats, smashing carburetors and commutators, while telephone girls cheered from the walk and small boys heaved bricks. The National Guard was ordered out. Colonel Nixon, who in private life was Mr. Caleb Nixon, secretary of the Pullmore Tractor Company, put on a long khaki coat and stalked through crowds with a .44 automatic in his hand. Even Babbitt's friend Clarence Drum, the shoe merchant,
a round and merry man who told stories at the athletic club, and who strangely resembled a Victorian pug dog, was to be seen as a waddling but ferocious captain, with his belt tight about his comfortable little belly and his round little mouth petulant as he piped to chattering groups on corners, "Move on now. I can't have any of this loitering." Every newspaper in the city, save one, was against the strikers. When mobs raided the news stands, at each was stationed a militiaman, a young, embarrassed citizen soldier with eyeglasses, bookkeeper or grocery clerk in private life, trying to look dangerous, while small boys yelped, "Get onto de tin soldier!" and striking truck drivers inquired tenderly, "Hey, Joe, when I was fighting in France, was you in camp in the States, or was you doing sweet exercises in the YMCA? Be careful that bayonet now, or you'll cut yourself." There was no one in Zenith who talked of anything but the strike, and no one who did not take sides. You were either a courageous friend of labor, or you were a fearless supporter of the rights of property, and in either case you were belligerent, and ready to disown any friend who did not hate the enemy. A condensed milk plant was set afire. Each side charged the other, and the city was hysterical. And Babbitt chose this time to be publicly liberal. He belonged to the sound, sane, right-thinking wing, and at first he agreed that the crooked agitators ought to be shot. He was sorry when his friend Seneca Doane defended arrested strikers, and he thought of going to Doane and explaining about these agitators. But when he read a broadside alleging that even on their former wages the telephone girls had been hungry, he was troubled. "All lies and fake figures," he said, but in a doubtful croak. For the Sunday after, the Chatham Road Presbyterian Church announced a sermon by Dr. John Jennison Drew on How the Savior Would End Strikes. Babbitt had been negligent about church-going lately, but he went to the service, hopeful that Dr. Drew really did have the information as to what the divine powers thought about strikes. Beside Babbitt, in the large, curving, glossy, velvet-upholstered pew, was Chum Frink. Frink whispered, "Hope the doc gives the strikers hell. Ordinarily I don't believe in a preacher butting into political matters. Let him stick to straight religion and save souls, and not stir up a lot of discussion. But at a time like this, I do think he ought to stand up and bawl out those pug uglies in a fare you well." "Yeah, well," said Babbitt. The Reverend Dr. Drew, his rustic bang flopping with the intensity of his poetic and sociologicador, trumpeted, "During the untoward series of industrial dislocations which have let us be courageous and admit it boldly, throttled the business life of our fair city these past days, there has been a great deal of loose talk about scientific prevention of scientific. Now let me tell you that the most unscientific thing in the world is science. Take the attacks on the established fundamentals of the Christian creed, which were so popular with the scientists a generation ago. Oh, yes, they were mighty fellows, and great poobahs of criticism. They were going to destroy the church. They were going to prove the world was created and has been brought to its extraordinary level of morality and civilization by blind chance. Yet the church stands just as firmly today as ever, and the only answer a Christian pastor needs make to the long-haired opponents of his simple faith is just a pitying smile. And now these same scientists want to replace the natural condition of free competition by crazy systems which, no matter what high-sounding names they are called, are nothing but a despotic paternalism. Naturally, I'm not criticizing labor courts. Injunctions against men have proven to be striking unjustly, or those excellent unions in which the men and the boss get together. But I certainly am criticizing the system in which the free and fluid motivation of independent labor is to be replaced by crooked-up wage scales and minimum salaries and government commissions and labor federations and all that
poppycock.
What is not generally understood is that this whole industrial matter isn't a question of economics. It's essentially and only a matter of love, and of the practical application of the Christian religion. Imagine a factory, instead of committees of workmen alienating the boss. The boss goes among them smiling, and they smile back. The elder brother and the younger brothers. That's what they must be, loving brothers. And then strikes would be as inconceivable as hatred in the home. It was at this point that Babbitt muttered, "Oh, rot!" "Huh?" said Chum Frink.
He doesn't know what he's talking about. It's just as clear as mud. Doesn't mean a darn thing.
Maybe, but... Frink looked at him doubtfully. Through all the service kept glancing at him doubtfully, till Babbitt was nervous. 2. The strikers had announced a parade for Tuesday morning, but Colonel Nixon had forbidden it, the newspaper said. When Babbitt drove west from his office at 10 that morning, he saw a drove of shabby men heading towards the tangled, dirty district beyond Courthouse Square. He hated them, because they were poor, because they made him feel insecure.
"Damn loafers. Wouldn't be common workmen if they had any pep," he complained.
He wondered if there was going to be a riot. He drove toward the starting point of the parade, a tangle of limp and faded grass known as Moore Street Park, and halted his car. The park and streets were buzzing with strikers, young men in blue denim shirts, old men with caps. Through them, keeping them stirred like a boiling pot, moved the militiamen. Babbitt could hear the soldiers' monotonous orders. "Keep moving. Move on. Bo. Keep your feet warm." Babbitt admired their stolid good temper. The crowd shouted, "Tin soldiers and dirty dogs, servants of the capitalist." But the militiamen grinned and answered only, "Sure, that's right. Keep moving, Billy." Babbitt thrilled over the citizen soldiers, hated the scoundrels who were obstructing the pleasant ways of prosperity, admired Colonel Nixon's striding contempt for the crowd, and as Captain Clarence Drum, the rather puffing shoe dealer, came raging by, Babbitt respectfully clamored, "Great work, Captain. Don't let 'em march." He watched the strikers filing from the park. Many of them bore posters with, "They can't stop our peacefully walking." The militiamen tore away the posters, but the strikers fell in behind their leaders and straggled off, a thin, unimpressive trickle between steel glinting lines of soldiers. Babbitt saw with disappointment that there wasn't going to be any violence, nothing interesting at all. Then he gasped. Among the marchers, beside the bulky young workman, was Seneca Doane, smiling, content. In front of him was Professor Brockbank, head of the history department in the State University, an old man and white-bearded, known to come from a distinguished Massachusetts family.
"My gosh," Babbitt marveled. "A swell like him, and with the strikers, and good old Senny Doane. They're fools to get mixed up with this bunch. They're parlor socialists, but they have got nerve, and nothing in it for them, not a cent. And I don't know, it's all the strikers look as such tough nuts. Look just about like anybody else to me."
The militiamen were turning the parade down a side street.
"They got just as much right to march as anybody else. They own the street as much as Clarence Drum of the American Legion does,"
Babbitt grumbled.
"'Course they're a bad element, but oh, rats."
At the athletic club, Babbitt was silent during lunch, while the others fretted, "I don't know what the world's coming to," or solaced their spirits with kidding. Captain Clarence Drum came swinging by, splendid in khaki.
"How's it going, Captain?" inquired Vergil Gunch.
"Oh, we got 'em stopped. We worked 'em off on side streets and separated 'em, and they got discouraged and went home. Fine work. No violence."
"Fine work, nothing," groaned Mr. Drum. "If I had my way, there'd be a whole lot of violence, and I'd start it, and then the whole thing would be over. I don't believe in standing back and wet-nursing these fellows and letting the disturbance drag on. I tell you, these strikers are nothing in God's world but a lot of bomb-throwing socialists and thugs, and the only way to handle 'em is with a club. That's what I'd do. Beat up the whole lot of 'em."
Babbitt heard himself saying,
"Oh, rats! Clarence, they look just about like you and me, and I certainly didn't notice any bombs."
Drum complained.
"Oh, you didn't, eh? Well, maybe you'd like to take charge of the strike. Just tell Colonel Nixon what innocents the strikers are. He'd be glad to hear about it."
Drum strode on, while all the table stared at Babbitt.
"What's the idea? Do you want us to give those hellhounds love and kisses, or what?" said Orville Jones.
"Do you defend a lot of hoodlums that are trying to take the bread and butter away from our families?" raged Professor Pumphrey. Vergil Gunch intimidatingly said nothing. He put on sternness like a mask. His jaw was hard. His bristly short hair seemed cruel. His silence was a ferocious thunder. While the others assured Babbitt that they must have misunderstood him, Gunch looked as though he had understood only too well. Like a robed judge, he listened to Babbitt's stammering.
"No, sure, of course they're a bunch of tough. But I just mean, strikes me as bad policy to talk about clubbing them. Cabe Nixon doesn't. He's got the fine Italian hand, and that's why he's colonel. Clarence Drum is jealous of him."
"Well," said Professor Pumphrey, "you hurt Clarence's feelings, George. He's been out there all morning getting hot and dusty, and no wonder he wants to beat the tar out of those sons of guns." Gunch said nothing, and watched, and Babbitt knew that he was being watched. 3. As he was leaving the club, Babbitt heard Chum Frink protesting to Gunch, "Don't know what's got into him. Last Sunday Doc Drew preached a corking sermon about decency in business, and Babbitt kicked about that, too, near as I can figure out." Babbitt was vaguely frightened. 4. He saw a crowd listening to a man who was talking from the rostrum of a kitchen chair. Stopped his car. From newspaper pictures he knew that the speaker must be the notorious freelance preacher, Beecher Ingram, of whom Seneca Doane had spoken. Ingram was a gaunt man with flamboyant hair, weather-beaten cheeks, and worried eyes. He was pleading, "If those telephone girls can hold out, living on one meal a day, doing their own washing, starving and smiling, you big hulking men ought to be able—" Babbitt saw that from the sidewalk Vergil Gunch was watching him. In vague disquiet he started the car and mechanically drove on, while Gunch's hostile eyes seemed to follow him all the way.
5. "Heard a lot of these fellows," Babbitt was complaining to his wife, "that think if workmen go on strike they're a regular bunch of fiends. Now, of course, it's a fight between sound business and the destructive element, and we got to lick the rough stuffin's out of 'em when they challenge us, but doggone if I see why we can't fight like gentlemen and not go calling 'em dirty dogs and saying they ought to be shot down."
"Why, George," she said placidly, "I thought you always insisted that all strikers ought to be put in jail."
"Never did. Well, I mean, some of 'em, of course, they're responsible leaders, but I mean a fellow ought to be broad-minded and liberal about things like—"
"But, dearie, I thought you always said these so-called liberal people were the worst of—"
"Rats! Women never can understand the different definitions of a word. Depends on how you mean it. And it don't pay to be too cocksure about anything. Now these strikers, honest, they're not such bad people, just foolish. They don't understand the complications of merchandising and profit the way we business men do. But sometimes I think they're about like the rest of us, and no more hogs for wages than we are for profits."
"George, if people were to hear you talk like that— of course I know you. I remember what a wild, crazy boy you were. I know you don't mean a word you say. But if people that don't understand you were to hear you talking like that, they'd think you were a regular socialist."
"What do I care what anybody thinks? And let me tell you right now, I want you to distinctly understand, I never was a wild, crazy kid. And when I say a thing, I mean it. I stand by it, and honest. Do you think people would think I was too liberal if I said the strikers were decent?"
"Of course they would.
But don't worry, dear. I know you don't mean a word of it. Time to trot up to bed now. Have you enough covers for tonight?"
On the sleeping porch he puzzled.
She doesn't understand me. Hardly understands myself. Why can't I take things easy the way I used to? Wish I could go out to Sandy Dunn's house and talk things over with him. No, suppose Verg Gunch saw me going in there. Wish I knew some really smart woman and nice that would see what I'm trying to get at. Let me talk to her, and wonder if Myra's right. Could the fellows think I've gone nutty just because I'm broad-minded and liberal? Way Verg looked at me.
End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 28. 1. Miss McGowan came into his private office at 3 in the afternoon with,
"Listen, Mr. Babbitt, there's a Mrs. Judique on the phone. Wants to see about some repairs, and the salesmen are all out. Want to talk to her?"
"All right." The voice of Tanis Judique was clear and pleasant. The black cylinder of the telephone receiver seemed to hold a tiny animated image of her, lustrous eyes, delicate nose, gentle chin. "This is Mrs. Judique. Do you remember me? You drove me up here to the Cavendish Apartments and helped me find such a nice flat."
"Sure, bet I remember. What can I do for you?"
"Why, it's just a little. I don't know that I ought to bother you, but the janitor doesn't seem to be able to fix it. You know my flat is on the top floor. With these autumn rains, the roof is beginning to leak, and I'd be awfully glad if—"
"Sure, I'll come up and take a look at it," nervously. "When do you expect to be in?"
"Why, I'm in every morning."
"Be in this afternoon in an hour or so?"
"Yes. Perhaps I could give you a cup of tea. I think I ought to, after all your trouble."
"Fine. I'll run up there as soon as I can get away." He meditated. "Now there's a woman that's got refinement, savvy, class. After all your trouble, give you a cup of tea. She'd appreciate a fellow. I'm a fool, but I'm not such a bad cuss. Get to know me, and not so much a fool as they think."
The great strike was over, the strikers beaten, except that Vergil Gunch seemed less cordial. There were no visible effects of Babbitt's treachery to the clan. The oppressive fear of criticism was gone, but a different loneliness remained. Now he was so exhilarated that, to prove he wasn't, he droned about the office for 15 minutes, looking at blueprints, explaining to Miss McGowan that this Mrs. Scott wanted more money for her house, had raised the asking price, raised it from $7,000 to $8,500. Would Miss McGowan be sure to put it down on the card? Mrs. Scott's house, raise. When he had thus established himself as a person unemotional and interested only in business, he sauntered out. He took a particularly long time to start his car. He kicked the tires, dusted the glass of the speedometer, and tightened the screws holding the windshield spotlight. He drove happily off toward the Bellevue district, conscious of the presence of Mrs. Judique as a brilliant light on the horizon. The maple leaves had fallen, and they lined the gutters of the asphalted streets. It was a day of pale gold and faded green, tranquil and lingering. Babbitt was aware of the meditative day, and of the barrenness of Bellevue. Blocks of wooden houses, garages, little shops, weedy lots. "Needs pepping up, needs the touch that people like Mrs. Judique could give a place," he ruminated as he rattled through the long, crude, airy streets. The wind rose, enlivening, keen, and in a blaze of well-being he came to the flat of Tanis Judique. She was wearing, when she flatteringly admitted him, a frock of black chiffon cut modestly round at the base of her pretty throat. She seemed to him very sophisticated. He glanced at the cretonnes and colored prints in her living room and gurgled, "Gosh, you've fixed the place up nice. Takes a clever woman to know how to make a home all right." "You really like it. I'm so glad. But you've neglected me scandalously. You promised to come up some time and
learned to dance."
Rather unsteadily. "Oh, but you didn't mean it seriously."
"Perhaps not, but you might have tried."
"Well, here I've come for my lesson, and you might just as well prepare to have me stay for supper."
They both laughed in a manner which indicated that of course he didn't mean it.
"But first, I guess I better look at the leak."
She climbed with him to the flat roof of the apartment house, a detached world of slatted wooden walks, clothesline, water tank, and a penthouse. He poked at things with his toe and sought to impress her by being learned about copper gutters, the desirability of passing plumbing pipes through a lead collar and sleeve and flashing them with copper, and the advantages of cedar over boiler iron for roof tanks.
"You have to know so much in real estate," she admired.
He promised that the roof should be repaired within 2 days.
Do you mind my phoning from your apartment?" he asked.
"Heavens, no."
He stood for a moment at the coping, looking over land of hard little bungalows with abnormally large porches in new apartment houses, small but brave, with variegated brick walls and terracotta trimmings. Beyond them was a hill with a gouge of yellow clay like a vast wound. Behind every apartment house, beside each dwelling, were small garages. It was a world of good little people, comfortable, industrious, credulous. In the autumnal light the flat newness was mellowed, and the air was a sun-tinted pool. "Golly, it's one fine afternoon. You get a great view here, right up Tanner's Hill," said Babbitt.
"Yes, it's nice and open."
"So darn few people appreciate a view."
"Don't you go raising my rent on that account." "Oh, that was naughty of me. I was just teasing. Seriously, though, there are so few people who respond, who react to views, I mean. They haven't any feeling of poetry and beauty."
"That's a fact. They haven't," he breathed, admiring her slenderness and the absorbed, airy way in which she looked toward the hill, chin lifted, lips smiling. "Well, guess I'd better telephone the plumbers so they'll get on the job first thing in the morning."
When he had telephoned, making it conspicuously authoritative and gruff and masculine, he looked doubtful and sighed,
"Suppose I better be—"
"Oh, you must have a cup of tea first."
"Well, it would go pretty good at that."
It was luxurious to loll in a deep green rep chair, his legs thrust out before him, to glance at the black Chinese telephone stand and the colored photograph of Mount Vernon, which he had always liked so much, while in the tiny kitchen so near, Mrs. Judique sang "My Creole Queen" in an intolerable sweetness, a contentment so deep that he was wistfully discontented. He saw magnolias by moonlight and heard plantation darkies crooning to the banjo. He wanted to be near her on pretense of helping her, yet he wanted to remain in his still ecstasy. Languidly he remained. When she bustled in with tea, he smiled up at her.
"This is awfully nice."
For the first time he was not fencing. He was quietly and securely friendly, and friendly and quiet was her answer. "It's nice to have you here. You were so kind, helping me to find this little home." They agreed that the weather would soon turn cold. They agreed that prohibition was prohibitive. They agreed that art in the home was cultural. They agreed about everything. They even became bold. They hinted that these modern young girls, well, honestly, their short skirts were short. They were proud to find that they were not shocked by such frank speaking. Tanis ventured, "I know you'll understand. I mean, I don't quite know how to say it, but I do think that girls who pretend they're bad by the way they dress really never go any further. They give away the fact that they haven't the instincts of a womanly woman." Remembering Ida Pudink, the manicure girl, and how ill she had used him, Babbitt agreed with enthusiasm. Remembering how ill all the world had used him, he told of Paul Riesling, of Zilla, of Seneca Doane, of the strike.
"See how it was? Course I was as anxious to have these beggars licked to a standstill as anybody else, but gosh, no reason for not seeing their side. For a fellow's own sake he's got to be broad-minded and liberal. Don't you think so?"
"Oh, I do."
Sitting on the hard little couch, she clasped her hands beside her, leaned toward him, absorbed him, and, in a glorious state of being appreciated, he proclaimed, "So I up and said to the fellows at the club, 'Look here, Do you belong to the Union Club? I think it's—' No, the Athletic. Tell you. Of course they're always asking me to join the Union, but I always say no. No, sir. Nothing doing. I don't mind the expense, but I can't stand all the old fogies." "Oh, yes, that's all. But tell me, what did you say to them?" "Oh, you don't want to hear it. I'm probably boring you to death with my troubles. You wouldn't hardly think I was an old duffer. I sound like a kid."
"Oh, you're a boy yet. I mean, you can't be a day over 45."
"Well, I'm not much, but by golly, I begin to feel middle-aged sometimes. All these responsibilities and all."
"Oh, I know." Her voice caressed him. It cloaked him like warm silk. "And I feel lonely, so lonely some days, Mr. Babbitt."
"We're a sad pair of birds, but I think we're pretty darn nice."
"Yes, I think we're a lot nicer than most people I know."
They smiled.
"But please, tell me what you said at the club."
"Well, it was like this. Of course Seneca Doane is a friend of mine. They can say what they want to. They can call him anything they please. But what most folks here don't know is that Senny is the bosom pal of some of the biggest statesmen in the world. Lord Wycombe, for instance. You know, this big British nobleman. My friend Sir Gerald Doak told me that Lord Wycombe is one of the biggest guns in England. Well, Doak or somebody told me."
"Oh, do you know Sir Gerald? The one that was here at McKelvey's?"
"Know him? Well, say, I know him just well enough so we call each other George and Jerry, and we got so pickled in Chicago—"
"That must have been fun, but—"
She shook a finger at him.
"I can't have you getting pickled. I'll have to take you in hand."
"Wish you would. Well, as I was saying, you see, I happen to know what a big noise Sonny Doane is outside of Zenith, but of course the prophet hasn't got any honor in his own country, and Senny, darn his old hide, he's so blame modest that he never lets folks know the kind of an outfit he travels with when he goes abroad. Well, during the strike, Clarence Drum comes parading up to our table, all dolled up fit to kill in his nice little captain's uniform, and somebody says to him, 'Bustin' the strike, Clarence?' Well, he swells up like a pouter pigeon, and he hollers, so's you could hear him, away up in the reading room, 'Yes, sure, I told the strike leaders where they got off, and so they went home.' Well, I says to him, glad there wasn't any violence. 'Yes,' he says, 'but if I hadn't 'a' kept my skin, there would have been. All those fellows had bombs in their pockets. They're regular anarchists.' 'Oh, rats, Clarence,' I says. 'I looked 'em all over carefully, and they didn't have any more bombs than a rabbit,' I says. 'Of course,' I says, 'they're foolish, but they're a good deal like you and me, after all.' And then Virgil Gunch or somebody, no, it was Chum Frink, you know, the famous poet, great pal of mine, he says to me, 'Look here,' he says, 'do you mean to say you advocate these strikes?' Well, I was so disgusted with a fellow whose mind worked that way that I swear I had a good mind to not explain at all, just ignore him."
"Oh, that's so wise,"
said Mrs. Judique. "But finally I explains to him, 'If you'd done as much as I have on Chamber of Commerce committees and all,' I says, 'then you'd have the right to talk. But same time,' I says, 'I believe in treating your opponent like a gentleman.' Well, sir, that held him. Frink, Chum, I always call him, he didn't have another word to say, but at that, I guess some of 'em kind of thought I was too liberal. What do you think?"
"Oh, you were so wise and courageous. I love a man to have the courage of his convictions."
"But do you think it was a good stunt? After all, some of these fellows are so darn cautious and narrow-minded that they're prejudiced against the fellow that talks right out of meaning."
"What do you care? In the long run, they're bound to respect a man who makes them think. And with your reputation for oratory, you—"
"What do you know about my reputation for oratory?"
"Oh, I'm not going to tell you everything I know, but seriously, You don't realize what a famous man you are."
"Well, though I haven't done much orating this fall. Too kind of bothered by this Paul Riesling business, I guess. But do you know, you're the first person that's really understood what I was getting at. Tanis, listen to me, will you? Fat nerve I've got calling you Tanis."
"Oh, do, and shall I call you George? Don't you think it's awfully nice when two people have so much, what shall I call it, so much analysis that they can discard all the stupid conventions and understand each other and become acquainted right away, like ships that pass in the night?"
"I certainly do. I certainly do."
He was no longer quiescent in his chair. He wandered about the room. He dropped on the couch beside her. But as he awkwardly stretched his hands toward her fragile, immaculate fingers, she said brightly, "Do give me a cigarette. Would you think poor Tanis was dreadfully naughty if she smoked?"
"Lord, no, I like it."
He had often and weightily pondered flappers smoking in Zenith restaurants, but he knew only one woman who smoked, Mrs. Sam Doppelbrau, this flighty neighbor. He ceremoniously lighted Tanis's cigarette, looked for a place to deposit the burnt match, and dropped it into his pocket. "I'm sure you want a cigar. You poor man," she crooned.
"Do you mind one?"
"Oh, no. I love the smell of a good cigar. So nice and like a man. You'll find an ashtray in my bedroom, on the table beside the bed, if you don't mind getting it." He was embarrassed by her bedroom, the broad couch with a cover of violet silk, mauve curtains striped with gold, Chinese Chippendale bureau, and an amazing row of slippers with ribbon-wound shoe trees, and primrose stockings lying across them. His manner of bringing the ashtray had just the right note of easy friendliness, he felt.
A boob like Virgil Gunch would try to get funny about seeing her bedroom, but I take it casually.
He was not casual afterward. The contentment of companionship was gone, and he was restless with desire to touch her hand. But whenever he turned toward her, the cigarette was in his way. It was a shield between them. He waited till she should have finished, but as he rejoiced at the quick crushing of its light on the ashtray, she said, "Don't you want to give me another cigarette?" And hopelessly he saw the screen of pale smoke and her graceful tilted hand again between them. He was not merely curious now to find out whether she would let him hold her hand, all in the purest friendship naturally, but agonized with need of it. On the surface appeared none of all this fretful drama. They were talking cheerfully of motors, of trips to California, of Chum Frink. Once he said delicately,
"I do hate these guys. I hate these people that invite themselves to meals, but I seem to have a feeling I'm going to have supper with the lovely Mrs. Tanis Judique tonight. But I suppose you probably already have 7 dates already."
"Well, I was thinking of going to the movies. Yes, I really think I ought to get out and get some fresh air." She did not encourage him to stay, but never did she discourage him. He considered,
"I better take a sneak. She will let me stay. There is something doing, and I mustn't get mixed up with it. I mustn't. I've got to beat it. Then no, it's too late now."
Suddenly, at 7, brushing her cigarette away, briskly taking her hand, "Tanis, stop teasing me. You know here we are, a couple of lonely birds, and we're awfully happy together. Anyway, I am. Never been so happy. Do let me stay. I'll gallop down to the delicatessen and buy some stuff, cold chicken maybe, or cold turkey, and we can have a nice little supper, and afterwards, if you want to chase me out, I'll be good and go like a lamb." "Well, yes, it would be nice," she said. Nor did she withdraw her hand. He squeezed it, trembling, and blundered toward his coat. At the delicatessen he bought preposterous stores of food, chosen on the principle of expensiveness. From the drugstore across the street he telephoned to his wife.
Got to get a fellow to sign a lease before he leaves town on the midnight. Won't be home till late. Don't wait up for me. Kiss Tinka good night."
He expectantly lumbered back to the flat. "Oh, you bad thing, you buy so much food," was her greeting, and her voice was gay, her smile acceptant. He helped her in the tiny white kitchen. He washed the lettuce, he opened the olive bottle. She ordered him to set the table, and as he trotted into the living room, as he hunted through the buffet for knives and forks, he felt utterly at home. "Now the only other thing," he announced, "is what you're going to wear. I can't decide whether you're to put on your swellest evening gown, or let your hair down and put on short skirts and make believe you're a little girl." "I'm going to dine just as I am in this old chiffon rag, and if you can't stand poor Tanis that way, you can go to the club for dinner."
"Stand you?" He patted her shoulder. "Child, you're the brainiest and the loveliest and finest woman I've ever met. Come now, Lady Wycombe, if you'll take the Duke of Zenith's arm, we will perambulate to the Magnolias Feed."
"Oh, you do say the funniest and nicest things."
When they had finished the picnic supper, he thrust his head out of the window and reported, "It's turned awful chilly, and I think it's going to rain. You don't want to go to the movies."
"Well,
"I wish we had a fireplace, and I wish it was raining like all get out tonight, and I wish we were in a funny little old-fashioned cottage, and the trees thrashing like everything outside, and a great big log fire. And I'll tell you, let's draw this couch up to the radiator and stretch our feet out and pretend it's a wood fire."
oh, I think that's pathetic, you big child."
But they did draw up to the radiator and prop their feet against it, his clumsy black shoes, her patent leather slippers. In the dimness they talked of themselves, of how lonely she was, how bewildered he, and how wonderful that they had found each other. As they fell silent, the room was stiller than a country lane. There was no sound from the streets save the whir of motor tires, the rumble of a distant freight train. Self-contained was the room, warm, secure, insulated from the harassing world. He was absorbed by a rapture in which all fear and doubting were smothered away, and when he reached home at dawn the rapture had mellowed to contentment, serene and full of memories. End of chapter 28.